Did you bring the wrong baby home from the hospital? Just kidding. But seriously, I've heard so many parents say, oh my gosh, I got my baby home and they woke up. They hate to be swaddled. They won't sleep unless I'm holding them. What is going on? So what is going on? Why did you get your baby home from the hospital and all of a sudden your baby acts like a different baby? In this episode, I'm going to tell you what happens with the transition from the hospital or the birthing center home and why all of a sudden your baby seems to hate to be swaddled, doesn't want to sleep unless he's being held. You start freaking out, wondering what is going on. I don't know how to care for my baby. What is going on? I'm going to tell you that all in this episode. So what happens is after the first 24 to 48 hours of life, your baby kind of moves out of that sleepy stage that they're in right after birth, and they're all of a sudden more aware of what's going on, and they can really easily get overstimulated. So it's really important that you make sure that you are paying attention to your baby's cues and also following recommendations for wake windows. If you don't know about wake windows, you can probably Google it or drop your questions in the comments below about wake windows or anything, and I'm happy to answer them in the comments. You need to know how to soothe your baby so that you can help your baby transition to sleep once they are overstimulated. So I can't tell you how many times I've walked into parents' room on postpartum and they are just completely strung out, haven't been able to go to sleep. Their baby's been awake for 4, 5, 6+ hours and they can't get their baby to go to sleep and they just are at their wits' end. Once your baby's overstimulated, once your baby has kind of passed that ideal wake window, it's really, really hard to get your baby to go back to sleep. So you want to make sure that you know the 5 S's so that you can help your baby transition back to sleep. Your 5 S's are shushing, sucking, swinging, side lying, and swaddling. I had to think about those. So the 3 primary S's that I use and that I found really helpful are shushing, which is going to be your white noise. If you do not have white noise, get it. You need white noise. You definitely need white noise for your newborn, and really it's going to be beneficial to you all throughout infancy. If you're thinking to yourself, oh, I don't want to get my baby used to sleeping with a noise, I'm telling you that you do. If you're ever going to do any kind of traveling or your baby's not sleeping in their own room, whatever, if your baby starts to associate that white noise with going to sleep, you can very easily pack up a $20 sound machine, take with you anywhere, turn your white noise on, and your baby sleeps great wherever you are. So invest in a $20 white noise machine. The next thing is sucking. So pacifier, sucking on a pacifier. I'm going to do a whole vlog on pacifiers later down the road, but for here I want to tell you that if breastfeeding is well established, meaning that your baby has a good latch, your milk has transitioned and started to come in or is fully in, and you feel that your baby needs that sucking to kind of help transition to go to sleep, totally fine to use a pacifier. The next thing is side lying and swaddling. So actually there's 4 primary things that I use. A pacifier is not always something that I use, but definitely swaddle, side lying, and white noise. One time I was doing an in-home consult for a family and they had a baby that was like, I think the baby was maybe 5 days old, and I went to their house and I was following up with them because their pediatrician was worried about weight gain issues. The baby had not been gaining weight like the pediatrician wanted the baby to. So I followed up for a lactation consult, and the mom was telling me that everything was going great, but that the baby was falling asleep with feeds and would only take like short little naps. So I could see it in her eyes. She was absolutely exhausted. We did a feeding. I saw exactly what was happening. The baby was not getting good pockets of rest between feedings, so she was falling asleep after each feeding, maybe only feeding for 5 or 10 minutes and then falling asleep. Mom wasn't getting good stimulation from breastfeeding because she wasn't getting good vigorous sucks because the baby was sleepy. And then the baby was waking up 15 minutes into her little cat nap because she wasn't full. She was hungry. So we had to break out of that cycle, and I helped that mom complete that feeding, and then we ended up coming up with a plan for Mom's Supply and then also for the baby to get full feedings. But the reason I'm telling you this is because after the feeding, we changed her diaper. The baby just started screaming frantically, like frantic screaming. And you'll learn your baby's cries. There's different cries for, whether they're hungry, they're tired, they're hurt. You'll definitely learn your baby's cries. But what I want to point out here is that this baby was so overstimulated that she had to cry to kind of burn that energy off. So we knew she had just had a good volume of food. We knew that she was burped. We knew her diaper was changed. She was swaddled. So what I did was I showed the parents a technique for helping her transition to that deep sleep when she's overstimulated. So what we did is we swaddled her, we turned her on her side. So I had her on my lap and I turned her on her side between my knees. I put a passy in her mouth and I kind of did a little jiggle motion to help her go to sleep. She cried frantically for maybe 2 minutes tops, fell asleep, and she slept for 3 solid hours. She was tired. She was very overstimulated. And then she woke up. She took a great feeding. And then those parents paid more attention to her sleepy cues and helped her transition to sleep before she got overstimulated. But again, they had the tools that they needed to help her transition to that deep sleep when and if she did get overstimulated. So the point in me telling you this is that you really need to know how to soothe your baby in case you get to that point. Honestly, that's really what happens with babies when they get home from the hospital and parents are feeling like they're having a hard time, that their baby is all of a sudden hyper alert. They won't go to sleep when you set them down. They just get really overstimulated. So make sure that you have the tools to get them soothed and help them drift off to that deep sleep if they need to. And the other thing I wanted to tell you about is swaddling. If you have said to yourself, my baby hates to be swaddled, I'm telling you, your baby does not. Now, if you're going with the straitjacket type swaddle, yeah, your baby probably hates to be swaddled. I cannot speak. I don't know what's going on with me. If you're going with the straitjacket type swaddle, I agree with you. Your baby probably does not like to be swaddled like that. Most babies like to be swaddled with their hands midline. They like to kind of have their hands up under their chin like this because that's how they were in the womb. They weren't swaddled straight down with their arms like this by their side with a tight swaddle. That's just not usually how babies like to be swaddled. So whatever swaddle sack you're using, you want to make sure that it allows them some flexibility with their arms. In the hospital, I bet you saw your nurses swaddle your baby perfectly. They looked like a little burrito. Maybe they slept perfectly still in that bassinet with that loose blanket swaddle. The reason that happened is because your baby was in those first 24 to 48 hours of life. I can guarantee you, as your baby starts to be more alert, more active, if you went back to the hospital a week later, 2 weeks later, and tried to swaddle them in that blanket, they'd be busting out of those blankets on the nurses at the hospital too. So I don't recommend a loose blanket as a swaddle for an effective swaddle. During the day, it's fine to use something like that if you're kind of going for shorter pockets of sleep. If you're trying to help your baby transition to sleep, sort of like I talked about earlier, that would be a good time to use a loose blanket swaddle. But the most important thing is that your baby cannot bust out of the swaddle. So as babies go through different sleep cycles, they can be a little bit active and sort of move around, and they can actually end up waking themselves up if they hit themselves in the face or they go like this. So anytime a baby goes like this, it makes them feel like they're falling, which wakes them up and can even make them fussy. That is why we swaddle. We swaddle to help babies feel secure, help prevent the startle reflex so they get more restful pockets of sleep between feedings, so that they can feed efficiently and effectively and be able to get more restful pockets of sleep. So the swaddle, definitely want to swaddle. There's lots of good swaddles out there. I personally like zipper swaddles at 2 a.m. I'm not a big fan of swaddles that babies can bust out of. I'm also not a big fan of 2 a.m. try to do a burrito with a loose blanket. It's not my cup of tea. So. last tip here I want to share with you is that in that first week or so after your baby delivers, if you're exclusively breastfeeding, we don't know whether your milk's going to come in on day 2, day 3, day 5, if you had some complications during labor or postpartum, like a postpartum hemorrhage. There's all kinds of complications that can affect your milk supply after delivery and how quickly it comes in. You want to make sure that you're paying attention to those wet and poopy diapers, making sure your baby is having some small periods of alertness after feeds. By small periods of alertness, I mean maybe 5 minutes in the newborn period. But making sure that your baby is, you're paying attention to signs that your baby is getting enough. So once your milk comes in, you'll hear your baby swallowing at the breast. It'll be more apparent that your baby is transferring a lot more because your breast will be softer after feeds. But when you're in the waiting, it can be really difficult to figure out if your baby is fussy because they're hungry, or are they fussy because they need to burp, or are they fussy because they did a rapid transfer of breast milk. There's all kinds of reasons why you might have a fussy baby, but generally, if you have a baby, if you're exclusively breastfeeding and you have a baby that is constantly fussy, doesn't want to be put down, is on borderline of having enough wet or poopy diapers, it would be worth a follow-up to a lactation consultant or the baby's pediatrician or pediatric provider to make sure that your baby is actually getting enough. Quick little bit of information here. I hear this a lot. You never want to wake a sleeping baby. Yes and no. After the first 2 weeks of life, I can get behind that statement. In the first 2 weeks of life, especially for breastfeeding babies, and really any baby that's not getting enough calories is going to be sleepy. If they're not getting enough calories, they're going to conserve their energy by being sleepy. So, do you want to let a baby who's not getting enough calories sleep as long as he wants to sleep? Probably not. Actually, no, you wouldn't. You'd want to make sure to wake them up for those feeds. In the first 2 weeks of life, until your baby's back to their birth weight, I really like to make sure that they're getting a feed at least every 4 hours. However, some feeds should be closer in duration. So we want to make sure that your baby in the first We want to make sure that your baby in the first 2 weeks of life is getting at least 8 feeds in a 24-hour window. And we don't want them going more than 4 hours without a feed. If you feel like you're getting in a cycle of snack feeds where your baby's feeding for 5 minutes, falling asleep, waking up 15 minutes later, acting like they're hangry, you do the feeding again, they only feed for 5 minutes, then they fall asleep, then they wake up hangry again, that's a cycle that's a little bit of a red flag to me. Cluster feeding can happen when you're waiting for your milk to come in or during growth spurts, and I'll talk about that in another vlog. But for now, I just want you to know that first week or two home from the hospital, if you find yourself in this cycle of snack feeds, baby that's not content, hangry, you can't get out of it, you're not having good pockets of rest between the majority of your feeds, then you're going to want to reach out to a lactation consultant sooner rather than later. Hit the subscribe button to get notifications for my videos that go live every Monday. Also, leave any comments, questions in the comments below, and I'll be sure to answer them.